It is a tremendous privilege for me to introduce to you Professor Michael Birenbaum Quintero. Tonight's first speaker is Associate Professor of Music, affiliated in African American and Latin American Studies. He has also worked at Bowdoin College, Johns Hopkins University, Peabody Conservatory, the Universidad del Valle in Cali, Colombia, and the Ministry of Culture of Colombia. Please join me in welcoming Professor Birenbaum Quintero.
Thanks. Thanks for the introduction. The stuff that I'm going to talk about today has nothing to do with anything that's in the book, but you're welcome to go out and buy it on December 3rd anyhow. What I'm going to be talking about today is something which is probably familiar to a lot of you, which is streaming music platforms. And the kinds of questions that I want to ask of streaming music platforms is essentially the question of what is the place of music in society? This is a pretty old question. You can always start with Plato. The Greeks always have something to say. So here is Plato, who goes on and on in the Republic about the importance of music for promoting a particular kind of citizen, a particular kind of member of society, and what is important about the right kind of music and the wrong kind of music for those purposes. The kinds of questions that I'm asking are a little bit more updated than the ancient Greeks. I'm interested, for example, in someone who in the 1940s someone called Theodor Adorno, who in the 1940s was talking about the pop music of the time, which, as you can see from the picture, was swing dance and jazz and all of that different stuff. And one of the things that Adorno was really concerned with was this idea of what kind of citizens does popular music during that period of time make? Right? And how does that support the idea of modern society, capitalism, and so on? And he has two very mostly pessimistic things to say. Number one, that the idea used to be, or the idea at one time was that when you're working, you're in the system, and that leisure is the place where you escape from the system and are able to become a whole person. And what he says is that leisure is increasingly, including musical leisure, is increasingly about a consumption. So in other words, the system gets you on the other side too. That is to say, outside of work. Secondly, the other thing that he's saying is that music teaches us, especially this kind of music, where there's a small amount of music which is broadcasted fire hose style out to the broadest possible population, and that it teaches us, although we think that we're dancing and being individuals and listening to jazz and being beatniks or hipsters or whatever there were back in the 1940s, in fact, what is being taught is a kind of conformity. He's a total pessimist. He's kind of a snob. He's absolutely no fun. But the question is a very interesting question, which is, what does the way in which music works, what is the way in which we listen to music and understand music, how does that affect the way in which we are members of our society? So, if we move forward, this kind of question about the division between, on the one hand, a really sort of calculated, profit-driven music industry versus real artistry is something that continues as a tension throughout the 20th into the 21st century. If you look at the history of rock and roll, in many ways what happens with rock and roll and after that hip-hop is this kind of back and forth between really sort of, broadcasting out exactly what the consumer wants, a sort of thoughtless, formulaic sort of, pap that people are forced to take in, right, versus the real artists who are sort of out and, making statements and going against the current and so on. And if we look at the history of rock and roll, it's this constant sort of back and forth between them. You have rock, in the 70s, you have arena rock, and then you have punk rock, and then you have hip-hop sort of emerges within and is incorporated within the music industry. In the 1980s, you have hair bands or arena rock, and then you have the grunge movement as this kind of real sort of authentic kind of artistry that's happening. And if you look at, for example, the death of Kurt Cobain, it comes in some ways, this is a guy who killed himself because he felt like he wasn't authentic enough. So this kind of back and forth, even if the two sides of the argument are a little bit exaggerated, is a kind of tension that exists within music history. So in 1999, when Napster and peer-to-peer file sharing and digital downloads and so on start to happen, people on the artistry side of it really start getting excited. This looks like the death of the music industry. This looks like the moment where you can skip the middleman. It's usually a man, I guess. Skip the middleman, where artists can go directly to their consumers and so on and so forth, where it's so cheap to produce something on your laptop. You don't need to put all this money in to producing an album at a studio, and so on and so forth, right? The second thing that's really important that the quote-unquote techno-optimists start saying in the previous decade, in the 2000s, is that production and consumption start to come together. Right? This is a moment of what is known as mashup culture, of remixes and all this stuff, right? Because when you're listening to music and when you're downloading music, you have the actual file there, and so it's really easy to sort of recombine them and do all of these different things. So you end up with all of these different ways in which, on YouTube, for example, which seems to be what Time is nodding to here, people sort of take things, consume them, and creatively reimagine them in such a way that it's no longer a matter of passive consumption, but now consumption, listening to music, taking in media, is now understood as a creative process. Well, that doesn't work out so well for the music industry, but then they hit on something which is very smart. You could see here, 1999, more or less, it starts going down. And what is the cause of what we can now describe as a re-entrenchment of the music industry? It's streaming. Streaming in Spotify, even YouTube, we can maybe think about as a streaming service, Pandora, Last.fm, Deezer, Songza. There's all kinds of these services, some now defunct, some still in existence, that have really changed the way in which music listening happens. One thing that's obvious is that it's a godsend for the music industry, which now is sort of is able to hold on to its intellectual property because you're not taking the files. Right? It's no longer a matter of you have access to property, but instead, you don't have ownership over property like the file, but you have access to all of the music that you could possibly want. It's like a subscription, all-you-can-eat buffet. So the music industry comes to realize that what it has as a value added is that it can guide you through this immense amount of music that exists. In Adorno's day, this was very different. You had a whole bunch of people, and they had a really hyper-concentrated music industry. Most music in the United States was being produced on one block in New York City called Tin Pan Alley, right? And so they would sort of blast that out to as many people as possible. Now, in the 2000s, you have this vast amount of music, and people are like, where do I even start? Right? And so what the music industry now does, the model is basically built on curating music and curating musical experience. Recommendations. So there's all different ways in which the different services work. Some of them sort of base things off of music. Some of them say people like you listen to this or that. Some of them, tag things and you sort of choose them. There's all different sort of models that are there. The important part that I want to emphasize is that some of these can be described as sort of lean-in kind of listening, where you make your own playlist and you sort of assemble everything and you leave nothing to chance, versus lean-out playlists, right? Where you have an algorithm or some other sort of automated thing that puts together what your musical experience is going to be. Sometimes you'll put in some of the different criteria of what you want that experience to be, and then it'll sort of shape it around that. One thing that the techno-optimists talked a lot about was the end of genre in some ways. So the techno-optimists were saying, now you can listen to whatever you want. Like back in my day when I was in high school, you would have to go to the store and buy this physical thing, right? And if you were walking home and you had like, I don't know, the heavy metal album and you didn't have like the heavy metal hair or whatever, like the heavy metal guys would like, you'd be like, on your case, right? So in other words, back in those days, music was really, really tied to different kinds of identity in a way in which now people are much more free-floating. You don't have to go all in to be like, punk rock person or whatever, right? You could sort of be a dilettante. You can move in and out. And so this makes, in some ways, as the techno-optimists have been talking about, really much more flexible, fluid kinds of identity, which is, I think, a positive and interesting thing. One ways in which these work is that they can do sort of the Amazon model of recommendation. So if you like William Shatner, you will love Leonard Nimoy in your, that's a Star Trek joke. And so that's one of the ways in which it works, right? So you can sort of track down the recommendations that it gives you along the sort of Amazon model. This is perfect for lean-in people like myself who want to know, oh, you know, I need the complete works or whatever. But I'm a musicologist and I'm a nerd, and I think that for the most part, actually, I don't do all of my music listening like that. A lot of the music listening that I do, just like everybody else, is kind of more on the lean out or passive side. This is from Songza, which no longer exists. It was bought up by Google, but it does one thing which is really typical, which is sort of put forward the idea of either moods or occasions or activities. There's something that's really interesting, that this is now, I think, the primary way that people listen to music. Music has become something like a kind of, maybe we could call it an emotional prosthesis. Like, I need to go to work and I need to be excited for work, so therefore I need this kind of music, right? Or I need, to go to sleep, or I need to study, so I need this kind of music to concentrate. Now, in Adorno's day, we could think about the idea of, capitalism moving in to take over the space of leisure. What we have now in our day is a way in which the idea of leisure and the idea of work are all tied up with each other, right? This is now the days of the neoliberal economy, where everyone has a side hustle, where everyone, does work that they love and then puts it on Instagram so they can get more people to hire them as a freelance interior decorator or whatever it is, right? And so the kinds of balance, or not necessarily balance, but the division between these different sort of forms of life or ways of living are very much tied together. And so we need to psych ourselves up for whatever it is that we need, because we're always on the clock. We could always need to have to do some kind of work, right? And so, you have these mood and activity playlists. I really like songs, so I want to give you these examples. Here's one for being awake. Having a classy dinner party, so faking that you're classy, doing drugs, being sad, having sex, being angry and fighting with someone, and so on and so forth. What I want to suggest here is that these forms of listening kind of intervene in our emotional lives in a very particular sort of way. So it's sort of in between this place of who we imagine ourselves to be and what we should be doing and what we actually are doing at a particular moment. One of the things that's really interesting about Spotify, for example, is they did a whole ad campaign in 2016 with information that they got from people. So they put this big billboard in Times Square that said, you there who listened to the song Sorry 52 times on Valentine's Day, what did you do, right? So they're showing how much information that they have about people. And in fact, what's interesting about some of these services is that they know your taste better than you do. They know my taste better than I do. So the question of what is an algorithmic self is not the question of the natural person and the artificial sort of thing that is outside of us, right? If we think about the classic idea of a cyborg, for example, you have the human brain and the robot brawn, or maybe the robot intellect but the human emotionality. Well, here we have a kind of robot emotionality. We have a kind of individuality which is tailored for us. So the question that arises about an algorithmic self is, what kind of self is a self in which we sort of lean back and let these sorts of algorithmic processes fill in and be more effective at being us than we are? This is a question that certainly leads to a kind of, if the model of listening is a lean back or passive listening, I think Adorno would really, really be interested in this sort of thing. But again, the question is not, I miss being human, it's so great to be human, we need to keep these machines out of our lives, because frankly, Frankenstein is already running around in the streets, Frankenstein is in our pockets, Frankenstein is certainly in our algorithms and our streaming apps. The question is, what is the logic behind the way that these algorithms work? And the fact of the matter is that music streaming ultimately is to sell is to sell us to advertisers, or in other words, the sort of profit motive is what underlies all of this. And so the question is, what do we think about the possibility of subcontracting out this part of our emotional lives to the profit motive. Seems like it might be a problem. At very least, it's an advertisement or a way of thinking about attentive listening. Thanks. We have time for some questions. 5 minutes for questions? Yes.
Hi. Oh.
There's a microphone going around, so wait for the mic.
Okay. Hi. Oh,
Hi.
I don't. Is this working? Oh, okay. I'm wondering how, since music now is something, especially with streaming, that it's a commodity that's not used up by consumption.
Yeah.
How do you think that affects the way that consumers place value on it?
Well, I think that what is an inexhaustible commodity is always going to be valued less, essentially. So what is a listener's paradise is in many ways an artist's hell. It's very hard to make music. It's very easy to make music. It's very hard to make a living as a musician, precisely because of these sorts of things. I mean, the money that goes from streaming goes to intellectual property holders. Who are the intellectual property holders? Not necessarily the songwriters, right? I think that it's absolutely a problem. David Byrne's fairly recent book, David Byrne of Talking Heads fame, has a book and he has this great essay from a couple years ago, I think in The Atlantic or The Guardian or one of these, that talks about sort of the death of New York. And part of what the death of New York is about the fact that it's so easy, it's such a listener's paradise, it's so easy to encounter art and music and film and so on, that it's actually very hard to make a living doing it. And that's one of the reasons behind the sort of cultural crisis or in New York City. So thanks for the question. Maybe another one? Don't be shy. Let me ask you a question. Raise your hand if you primarily listen to music through a streaming service. Yes! Suspicion confirmed. No questions? All right. Oh, there's one.
Hi, I'm over here.
Where are you?
To your left.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Doug. Do you think that we're going to see, an increase in the future of, well, I guess I should say a decrease in streaming and maybe a return to physical media as an alternative source of taking in music? Will there be any kind of shift in the paradigm, any kind of reason for that to happen again?
There already has been, to a certain degree. So vinyl has started to sell more than it used to. Cassettes have started to sell more than they used to, because as long as there is any kind of, sort of musical system, there's always going to be a hipster who wants to do it the other way, right? There's always going to be that person. And so physical media and old media are actually something which become really, really valuable. I think Jack Black recently did a set of 578s of old music, which sold for like tons and tons and tons of money, precisely because physical media is now so rare that the price goes up.
Where you can take like one-off tracks and they save every take you do, and so it, instead of music being like streamable and repeatable all the time, you like actually have something that's worth value because there's only one of them. And I think that's kind of a cool service people are providing.
Or the Wu-Tang album that Martin Shkreli bought, right? The one copy of the Wu-Tang album, right? Yeah. Thanks.